By the time the broadcast ended, Ted Nugent would be gone, not just from the interview set but from the building entirely, leaving behind a wireless microphone still clipped to his vest and a production crew who would spend the next hour trying to understand what they had just witnessed. One phrase would haunt him forever, replayed across every social media platform by morning. "I don't answer to some DEI hire from Texas." What made him say it? What made a man who had spent 50 years performing in front of millions flee from a 38-year-old congresswoman armed with nothing but a tablet and 3 manila folders? You're going to want to hear this. The interview had been scheduled as a friendly platform. Conservative podcast circuit, sympathetic host. Nugent was there to promote his new book and discuss what he called the systematic destruction of American values by the radical left. The set was his territory. Dark leather chairs, American flags and soft focus behind him. Studio lights positioned to catch the silver in his hair and the confidence in his weathered face. He had done 1,000 interviews like this. He knew how they worked. Friendly questions, long answers, applause breaks. The host tees up the topic, the guest delivers the talking points, and everyone goes home satisfied. Jasmine Crockett had not been on the original guest list. She had been added 48 hours before taping at the specific request of the network's programming director, who wanted what he called balance. Nugent's team had been told she would appear for a brief 10-minute segment near the end of the hour, time enough for what they assumed would be a polite disagreement on policy that would make the show look fair-minded without threatening Nugent's narrative control. They had not been told she had requested the full broadcast rundown 3 days prior. They had not been told she had spent 6 hours the previous evening reviewing Nugent's public statements dating back to 2007, and they certainly had not been told about the folders. When Nugent entered the studio that morning, he was in the expansive mood of a man who owned every room he entered. He greeted the crew by name, asked about their families, signed an intern's guitar with a silver Sharpie, and settled into his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had never experienced an interview he could not control. The host opened with soft questions about the new book, about the state of American culture, about the courage it took to speak uncomfortable truths in an era of cancel culture. Nugent answered in long, winding passages filled with hunting metaphors and references to the founding fathers. He was warm, funny, self-deprecating in the calculated way of men who know their self-deprecation will be rejected by their audience as false modesty. 25 minutes passed. The host had not asked a single challenging question. Then the segment break happened, and when the cameras came back, Jasmine Crockett was sitting in the chair beside him. Nugent's smile did not falter, but something in his posture changed. He had been leaning back. Now he was upright. He extended his hand across the small table between them with the hearty enthusiasm of a man determined to control the tone of what came next. She shook it once, briefly, and placed 3 folders on the table in front of her with the care of someone handling evidence in a courtroom. Nugent glanced at the folders. His smile widened. "Brought your homework, I see," he said, voice rich with amusement. The host laughed. Nugent leaned back again, fingers laced across his stomach. "I appreciate a woman who comes prepared, even if she's about to be wrong." The phrase hung in the air for just a moment. Crockett said nothing. She opened the first folder, removed a single sheet of paper, and placed it face down on the table. Her expression had not changed. She looked at Nugent the way a prosecutor looks at a witness during cross-examination, not with hostility, but with the absolute certainty that the next 60 seconds would matter more than the witness understood. The host tried to regain control. "Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for joining us. Ted was just telling us about his concerns regarding what he sees as the erosion of American values. I know you have a different perspective on some of these issues." It was a soft toss, an invitation to disagree politely and move on. Crockett did not take it. Instead, she turned the piece of paper over and slid it across the table toward Nugent. "Mr. Nugent," she said, voice calm and precise, "you've made a career out of criticizing people in public service. You've questioned their patriotism, their intelligence, and their right to hold office. You've been particularly vocal about members of Congress who you believe don't deserve their positions." She paused. Nugent was still smiling, but his eyes had moved to the paper. "I'd like to talk about your qualifications to make those judgments." Nugent laughed. It was a big, theatrical laugh designed to signal to the audience that whatever was happening was beneath him. "My qualifications? Sweetheart, I've been speaking truth to power since before you were born. I don't need a law degree to recognize incompetence when I see it." The word "sweetheart" landed exactly as he intended it to land, dismissive, belittling. the kind of casual condescension that men of his generation wielded like a verbal pat on the head. He was still smiling, still relaxed, still certain this would go the way every other interview had gone. Crockett's expression did not change. She did not acknowledge the word. She simply continued. The document in front of you is a transcript of your testimony before the Michigan State Senate in 2011. You were invited to speak about wildlife management policy. Do you remember that testimony? Nugent glanced down at the paper. His smile tightened slightly at the edges. I've testified before a lot of state legislatures. I'm an expert on conservation and land management. What's your point? She opened the second folder without answering his question. Inside were 6 pages, each one marked with colored tabs. She did not remove them yet. In that testimony, you stated that you had personally managed over 15,000 acres of hunting land in Michigan for more than 20 years, and that your management practices had increased deer populations by 40% while maintaining ecological balance. You cited those credentials as the foundation for your policy recommendations. Is that accurate? Absolutely accurate, Nugent said. His voice had an edge now. He was no longer leaning back. I've spent my entire life in the field. I know more about wildlife management than 99% of the bureaucrats making policy. Crockett pulled the first page from the second folder and placed it next to the transcript. This is the deed record for the property you referenced in your testimony. Sunrise Acres, Jackson County, Michigan. According to county records, you purchased that property in 2004. That's 7 years before your testimony, not 20. The property consists of 840 acres, not 15,000. And according to the Michigan Department of Natural Resources population surveys conducted in 2009, 2010, and 2011, deer populations in that management unit decreased by 18% during the period you claimed a 40% increase. She paused. Her voice had not risen. She was not angry. She was simply reading facts from documents that sat in front of both of them. So which part of your sworn testimony was accurate, Mr. Nugent? The silence that followed was brief, but total. Nugent's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been relaxed in his lap, were now gripping the arms of his chair. Those are bureaucratic records, he said. His voice had changed. It was harder now, defensive. Government agencies get things wrong all the time. I know what I saw on my land. Crockett pulled the second page from the folder. This is a letter from the Michigan DNR dated March 2012, 6 months after your testimony. It's addressed to the State Senate Environment Committee. It specifically references your testimony and provides corrections to the factual claims you made. The letter notes that your property size, ownership duration, and population impact claims were all materially inaccurate. The committee chairman requested that you submit a correction to the record. Did you ever submit that correction? Nugent did not answer immediately. His eyes moved from the document to the host, then back to Crockett. I don't recall being asked to correct anything. She pulled the third page. This is the certified mail receipt showing the letter was delivered to your primary residence in April 2012. You signed for it personally. She placed the receipt next to the letter. Both documents were visible to the cameras. So you did receive the request. You chose not to respond. The host shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was not the segment he had been promised. This was not balance. This was something else entirely. I think what Ted is saying is that field experience sometimes differs from official data. Crockett did not let him finish. Her eyes had not left Nugent. Mr. Nugent, you've built a public career on calling elected officials incompetent, unqualified, and dishonest. You've said members of Congress don't know what they're talking about when they make policy. You've specifically questioned whether people like me belong in government at all. She paused. The room was very quiet. But you lied under oath to a state legislative committee about your credentials. You inflated your land holdings by 1,700%. You claimed 2 decades of experience you didn't have. You fabricated population data, and when you were caught, you ignored the request to correct the record. Her voice was still calm, clinical. So I'd like to know, what qualifies you to judge anyone else's fitness for public service? Nugent's face had gone red. Not the flush of embarrassment, but the deep crimson of a man whose authority had just been challenged in a way he had not experienced in decades. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said, voice rising. This is the kind of gotcha politics that's destroying this country. You dug through bureaucratic records to try to discredit me instead of addressing the actual issues. Crockett opened the third folder. Inside were not 6 pages, but what looked like 30 or more. Organized with tabs in different colors. Nugent saw them and stopped mid-sentence. She did not remove any of them yet. She simply let him see that they existed. "We can talk about issues if you'd like," she said, "but first I'd like to finish documenting the pattern." "What pattern?" Nugent's voice had a tremor in it now. He was no longer smiling. She pulled the first document from the third folder. 2016, interview with Outdoor Life magazine. You stated you had harvested over 200 white-tailed deer in your lifetime and that your success rate proved the effectiveness of traditional hunting methods over modern wildlife management science. The magazine later published a correction noting that Michigan hunting records showed you had registered 43 deer harvests over a 30-year period, not 200, and that 31 of those were doe permits issued during population control seasons, not the trophy bucks your statement implied. She pulled the second document. 2018. Testimony before the Texas State Board of Education regarding science curriculum standards. You claim to have studied wildlife biology at the University of Michigan and that your academic background gave you authority to critique the teaching of ecology. The university registrar confirmed you attended for one semester in 1967 and withdrew before completing any courses. She pulled the third document. 2020. Interview on a podcast with 6 million downloads. You stated you had been invited to serve as an advisor to 3 presidential administrations on conservation policy, but had declined because you didn't trust Washington. Freedom of Information Act requests to the Executive Office of the President for the Reagan, Bush, and Trump administrations returned no records of any such offers, invitations, or communications. Each document landed on the table with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent studio. Nugent was staring at the growing pile of paper in front of him. His hands had left the chair arms and were now flat on the table, as if he needed to steady himself. "You're taking things out of context," he said. His voice had lost all its earlier warmth. "You're twisting my words." Crockett looked at him with something that might have been pity if it had contained any emotion at all. "Mr. Nugent, these are your exact words. From interviews you gave, testimony you provided under oath, statements you made to millions of people. I'm not twisting anything. I'm simply reading them back to you next to the documented facts." She paused. "The pattern is very clear. You consistently, over decades, exaggerate your credentials, fabricate your expertise, and misrepresent facts to position yourself as an authority you are not, and then you use that false authority to attack other people's qualifications." The host tried to intervene. "I think we should take a step back here." "No." Nugent's voice cut across the studio. He was standing now, though neither Crockett nor the host had moved. "This is ambush journalism. This is exactly the kind of dishonest, partisan attack that proves everything I've been saying about the radical left. You brought me here under false pretenses to try to humiliate me on camera." Crockett remained seated. Her hands were folded on top of the closed third folder. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been, but somehow it carried more weight. "Mr. Nugent, you called me a DEI hire when I sat down. You dismissed me as someone who brought homework but would be wrong. You've spent the last 20 years calling people like me incompetent, unqualified, and dangerous." She paused. The cameras were still rolling. Every person in the studio had stopped what they were doing. "I'm a graduate of Bowie State University and Howard University School of Law. I practiced civil rights law for 6 years before running for office. I've never lied under oath. I've never fabricated my credentials. I've never inflated my resume to attack someone else's." She opened the third folder one final time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a list of every time in the last 5 years that you have publicly questioned the intelligence, qualifications, or right to serve of a black woman in elected office. There are 47 entries. Each one is sourced. Each one is documented. Each one is on video or in print." She placed the list on the table between them. "So I have one very simple question for you, and I'd like you to answer it on camera, for the record, right now." Nugent was still standing. His face was the color of raw meat. His chest was rising and falling in a way that suggested he was having trouble controlling his breathing. The host had his hand raised slightly, as if he might call for a commercial break, but he seemed frozen by what was happening in front of him. Crockett's voice was very calm, very clear. "Given that you have repeatedly, provably, and deliberately lied about your own credentials and expertise, what gives you the right to question mine?" The silence that followed was absolute. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Somewhere in the control room, someone's coffee cup touched a desk, and the sound carried through the studio like a gunshot. A camera operator shifted weight from one foot to the other, and the floor creaked. Nugent's mouth opened. No sound came. He tried again. Nothing. His eyes moved from Crockett to the host to the cameras to the folders spread across the table like evidence in a trial. 20 seconds, 25. His right hand came up and gripped the wireless microphone clipped to his vest. He pulled it off with a motion so sharp the clip broke and clattered onto the floor. "I'm done here," he said, his voice cracked on the word done. "This is bullshit. This is an ambush. You people are dishonest hacks, and I'm not participating in this anymore." He turned and walked toward the exit, not the calm walk of someone choosing to leave, but the fast, stiff-legged stride of someone fleeing. The host stood up, hand extended in a gesture that might have been an attempt to stop him or might have been pure shock. "Ted, we can take a break, we can—" But Nugent was already through the door. The sound of it slamming echoed through the studio. The red lights on the cameras were still on. They had captured everything. Crockett sat very still in her chair. Her jacket was perfectly smooth. Her hands were still folded on top of the folder. She looked at the host with an expression that contained no triumph, no satisfaction, no anger, just a kind of exhausted patience. "I think that answers my question," she said quietly. The host stared at the door Nugent had exited through, then back at the table covered in documents, then at Crockett, then at the cameras. He seemed to be trying to formulate a sentence and failing. Finally he managed, I think we need to go to commercial." But before the cameras cut, Crockett spoke one more time. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but every microphone in the studio caught it perfectly. "For the record, I didn't come here to ambush anyone. I came here to do what Mr. Nugent has always claimed to do, speak truth. The difference is I brought receipts." The commercial break lasted 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, the production team tried frantically to reach Nugent's manager, his publicist, anyone who might convince him to return to the set. But Nugent was gone, not just from the studio, but from the building. Security footage would later show him exiting through the back parking structure at a pace that could only be described as a run, still wearing the broken microphone clip, his truck pulling out of the lot before the commercial break even ended. When the cameras came back, the host was alone in his chair. The chair Nugent had occupied was empty. The documents were still spread across the table. The host looked directly into the camera and did something that would later be analyzed by media critics as either the most honest moment in cable news history or the most cowardly. He told the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, Ted Nugent has left the building. He chose not to answer Congresswoman Crockett's question. I want to be very clear about what you just witnessed. The documents she presented are real. I've had our team verify them during the break. The Michigan DNR letter is authentic. The university registrar records are accurate. The pattern she documented is supported by evidence." He paused, took a breath. "I have spent 20 years in this business trying to create spaces for honest disagreement. But what just happened was not a disagreement. It was a confrontation between someone who speaks in rhetoric and someone who speaks in facts, and when the facts arrived, the rhetoric fled." Crockett remained in her chair throughout this statement, saying nothing, her expression unchanged. When the host finally turned to her and asked if she had anything to add, she shook her head once. "No," she said. "The record speaks for itself." The network ran the remaining 30 minutes of the scheduled hour-long program with Crockett alone, taking questions from the host about her work in Congress, her legislative priorities, and her views on accountability in public discourse. She answered each question with the same measured precision she had used to dismantle Nugent's credibility. No celebrating, no gloating, just facts, supported by evidence, delivered with the calm authority of someone who had never needed to exaggerate to be heard. But before the program ended, the host asked one final question. "Congresswoman, Ted Nugent called you a DEI hire when you sat down. He's not the first person to use that phrase to dismiss your qualifications. How do you respond to that?" Crockett was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight it had not held even during the confrontation. "Mr. Nugent questioned my qualifications because he assumed he had better ones, but he didn't have qualifications. He had lies. He had exaggerations. He had decades of unchallenged fabrications that nobody bothered to check because he was loud, confident, and willing to attack people who couldn't fight back." She looked directly into the camera. "I don't need to defend my qualifications to men like him. My degrees are real. My experience is documented. My record is public. What I need to do is make sure that the next time someone like him tries to dismiss someone like me, there's a receipt waiting. Because this isn't about me. It's about every person who has ever been told they don't belong by someone whose only credential was the audacity to lie without consequence." She paused. The studio was completely silent. "That ends when we stop letting it be easier to lie than to tell the truth. That ends when we make people answer simple questions. That ends when we bring the folders." The program ended. The cameras cut. Crockett gathered her 3 folders, placed them in her bag, shook the host's hand, and walked out of the studio with the same measured calm she had walked in with. But the impact of what had just happened was only beginning. Within 2 hours, clips of the confrontation were circulating on every social media platform. The 25-second silence became the most shared political video of the week. Nugent's website went dark that evening. His publisher released a statement saying the book tour would be postponed for personal reasons. The Michigan State Senate quietly removed his 2011 testimony from their official record. Conservative media outlets that had promoted his appearance spent the next 3 days either ignoring what had happened or claiming the documents were fabricated, though none could produce evidence to support that claim. And Jasmine Crockett's office received 4,000 emails in 48 hours. 92% of them said the same thing in different words. Thank you for bringing the receipts, because that's what it came down to. Not rhetoric, not performance, not the ability to shout louder or dominate a room or dismiss someone with a condescending phrase. Just 3 folders, just documented facts, just a woman who had been called unqualified by a man who had spent decades lying about his own qualifications and who had decided that this time the lie would not go unchallenged. Ted Nugent had entered that studio believing he owned every room he entered. He left believing something very different. He left believing that maybe, just maybe, the people he had dismissed for so long had been doing their homework, and when you haven't done yours, when your credentials are fabrications and your authority is performance, the homework wins, every single time. The empty chair sat on that set for the rest of the broadcast day, a silent monument to what happens when arrogance meets preparation. And across the country, in living rooms and offices and WhatsApp threads, people who had spent years being told their qualifications weren't good enough watched the footage and felt something they had not felt in a very long time. The satisfaction of watching truth, armed with evidence, calmly destroy the lie that had lasted decades. That's not partisan politics. That's not gotcha journalism. That's just accountability. And it turns out when you bring the folders, accountability sounds a lot like 25 seconds of absolute silence.